Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Balkan Devlen. I'm the Senior Fellow and Director of the Transatlantic Program here at MLI. And today I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Jonathan Berkshire Miller, who's the Director of Foreign Affairs, National Defense, and National Security here at MLI. Jonathan, welcome.
Thanks so much, Balkan. It's always fun to do these things.
Yes, this is another edition of Inside Policy Talks, where we will be talking about the upcoming NATO summit in Vilnius next week. It is, of course, a very important event for Canada as well as the transatlantic allies, as Russia's unprovoked and illegal war in Ukraine rages on. The issue and the NATO membership is an important part of that of this summit. So it's going to be one of the most consequential summits probably in the last decade or so. So there are a few issues today that we would like to touch upon and bring up the Canadians up to speed about the things that actually important themes among the many that will be discussed at Vilnius Summit. Jonathan, you and I are writing a series of op-eds for National Post on these themes. So I want to sort of go over those. The first of those op-eds was out earlier this week. We talked about Ukraine and Ukraine's place, future membership in NATO, and we do have a number of other op-eds coming up. China, as well as defense spending. So let's give the audience a bit of an overview of the central themes that we think would be important for Canada and for Canadians when it comes to the NATO summit next week, July 11th and 12th. So, what is your sort of broad overview take on the summit and why it is important and why do we need to pay attention to the summit?
Well, thanks a lot. I mean, I guess at the first blush, we have so many of these different international summits now, alphabet soup from G7 to G20 to APEC, East Asia Summit, and now NATO. So I think to an outside observer, Balkan, it's really important to sort of frame that as why should we care? Why should we care about another international summit? There are several reasons why you should care. Why this is a sort of a different a period of time and a different importance for the alliance. And we try to outline these in our National Post series, as you said, Balkan. I think first and foremost, of course, in everyone's mind is our Ukrainian friends who are not just fighting for themselves and fighting for their own territory in Ukraine against in the backdrop of Russia's brutal reinvasion, which started in 2014 and continues at a more brutal scale now since we've seen in February 2022. So obviously that's first and foremost on the mind, and I think that what we have argued in our piece, and we've been arguing actually at the Institute for the past several years, and even before actually Russia's reinvasion in February 2022, is that Ukraine needs to take a much more stronger role within the Western orbit. I think especially after Russia's actions in February 2022, we argue that Ukraine has a rightful place in the alliance. And this can't just be sort of some wordsmithing where we all say the right things and Ukraine comes off happy, but we actually have to have a tangible roadmap where they can have that rapid integration into the alliance. So I think that's point number one. But the interesting thing is that there's a lot of other areas that NATO is expanding into. We're seeing now, for example, on the emerging technology front, on space, cyber domains, NATO is paying a lot of attention to this, as it rightly should. And these don't respect the boundaries of the old way of thinking about the transatlantic security. So this leads us a little bit into the second point, which is the role of China, the disruptive nature that China is playing globally. And Canadians, of course, have had a front row seat to some of these tensions. We released our Indo-Pacific strategy last November. And within that, China was recognized as a disruptive actor. And I think the Institute has been noting this for several years, again, well before the Indo-Pacific strategy was even a possible thing. We've been talking about some of the challenges that China poses to Canada and to our allies. And NATO has recognized this as well. So We have the leaders of the quote unquote AP4, Asia Pacific 4, which is the key liberal democracies in the region, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. The leaders will, in all likelihood, be in Vilnius next week, following up on their first inaugural visit to the NATO summit last year. All of this is very important, not because NATO is moving, and expanding to the Indo-Pacific, but NATO engages with the Indo-Pacific. So I think this is the important sort of nuance and difference, is that the issues that will affect the alliance and many of the members of the alliance transcend the transatlantic sphere. And we're starting to realize this with China on traditional security issues, but also through industrial policy, economic security, technology, and many other realms. So that's the second key area that I think is of importance to Canadians. And then the third one, and Balkan, we can have a bit of discussion on this one too, is the so what factor. So what, in a Canadian perspective, do we do about these issues? What can we do about Ukraine? What can we do about the challenge that China poses? Some of this will be diplomatic, some of this will be through the economic realms and in alerting our businesses, but we actually have to have a hard defense role as well. And Canada, with its GDP to defense spending lagging in the 1.3% realm, just is not sufficient anymore. We can't continue to go to NATO summits and sort of pass the buck. So I think that we really believe, and I'm not certain that we're going to see anything significant from a policy change in this NATO summit, but Canada really needs to step up, both in raw terms as far as what sort of numbers of spending we have, what types of capabilities that we put forward, but also the sort of roles and responsibilities that we have. Canada has a rich history militarily of stepping up. We stepped up during both world wars, during the Korean War, Persian Gulf War, Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not that we don't have a history of stepping up and doing the right thing, but when those capabilities are not there, our armed forces are hamstrung. So I think this is the last point, I'll pass it over to you, Balkan, is that we really need to be much more serious when it comes to defense issues.
No, absolutely. I mean, there are, I think, two sort of phrases I keep saying whenever we talk about NATO, Canada's place in the transatlantic alliance, as well as what we need to do in the Pacific with regards to war in Russia, how to deal with China. One is when it comes to Ukraine, supporting Ukraine is not charity, but enlightened self-interest for us. But the second thing is that actually ties these together is that we don't want to spend pennies today. We will spend hundreds of dollars in the future, right? So we don't want to make the necessary commitments or short-term pain that would come with a significant increase in resources, both military and diplomatic, and the costs of that, because we want to avoid that short-term pain. But the result would be that we will be paying a much bigger price, not only in terms of treasure, but potentially in terms of blood as well, down the road if we do not step up today. And I think all these three themes that you just highlighted, those two things actually tie it together. So long-term visioning of what the Canadian national interests are, how to promote that particular national interest, and what resources do we need to dedicate to achieve and protect those interests, I think will be key. And I think having that sort of a long-term vision, unfortunately, seems to be missing. There is no, when was the last foreign policy review? 2004. We do have a defense policy update coming up, but there is no national security strategy, which should ideally be embedded in a broader foreign policy vision, and we start from the bottom rather than all these other pictures. So I think that also suggests a lack of long-term thinking, and in a way sort of almost winging it as a pressure from allies, from our American allies, from our European allies, and from our Pacific allies, basically asking Canada to step up, that you can no longer be a laggard in these issues. I think I want to make two quick points, and I think we can sort of slowly discuss all those, maybe expand on those three themes a little bit as well. One is the surprisingly, you see it in the media more and more now, our European allies, Americans and others, increasingly vocal about our not stepping up when it comes to the commitments that we have towards our allies and their security. I think this is becoming more and more, especially when it comes to NATO and defense spending. It became much more sort of clear and obvious today. I do agree. I mean, one of the criticisms of the 2% argument is that it's just not a particularly good metric, but so is GDP, right? I mean, of course, it does leave certain things. It's not a perfect metric. Yes, it matters on what you spend and what sort of capabilities are there. But I think even with a very sort of rough metric, an imperfect metric that finally the alliance agreed on, if we're not sort of keeping up on that and use it as an excuse that this is not a good metric, it's not going to fly anymore. It might have been fine even back in early 2010s, but now, especially after Russia's war in Ukraine, it's very clear that the alliance and our allies are getting much more impatient. And not only we're not meeting the 2%, but I think we're also not. I need to sort of check it out, but I think we are not also meeting the 20% in capital investment component, and we are either one of the 4 or 5 countries in NATO that does not meet that either. So, there is a significant capabilities gap there. And of course, what and where to spend that money on. Our colleague Richard Schmuka wrote a lot on these things. Christian Lebrecht write about these issues. What capabilities Canada need to focus on in defending the Arctic, in providing security in the eastern flank, beefing up our presence in Latvia, bringing it up to a brigade level from a battalion level, engaging with our allies and partners in the Pacific. What do we need? What kind of capabilities do we need? Again, that all requires a clear articulation of the national interest and how we need to pursue that. And unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be there yet. So we'll see whether I mean it was 4 days to go to the summit. The defense update is still not here. I forgot, someone recently wrote that they'll be surprised if the update doesn't disappoint. So we'll see whether will it be announced in the summit. What will be the reaction of our allies? I think we might be in for a rude awakening at the summit and the reactions to it if we do not deliver concrete promises and funding attached to those promises when it comes to defense.
I mean, just quickly on that point, Balkan, I mean, it's an excellent point. And I would argue if there was something significant from a policy perspective coming out of this update that could feed into the NATO summit, it would have been released weeks before. No one releases. If a document gets released, what is it, a Friday?
Yes.
Friday at 3:45 p.m., and the NATO summit's next week, clearly they're trying to shrug this under the rug because all the allies are busy, preparing for the summit. So if we really wanted to show something, not just to Canadians, but also to our allies, this would have been released about a month ago or a couple months ago, or even before that.
Yeah, I mean, you and I will be heading to Vilnius this weekend to attend the NATO public forum, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will be speaking in the first day of the forum. He's in the program. I'm very much looking forward to the kind of questions that our allies might be posing to the Prime Minister when he is, he's not only meeting with his peers, but also with the experts, with the think tank community, with the civil society there. And I think that will also give us a good sense of sort of in a way a thermometer of how the allies are feeling.
Well, one thing that, I mean, we've been talking about, we've done some good work on public polling, and others in Canada have done it too. And I think it's important to sort of get away from the talking points that Canadians just don't understand these issues, or don't understand the security threats, or are not interested in them. are focused on domestic issues, because the reality of a lot of the public polling we've done internally is that Canadians are actually very clear about who their friends and allies are. They're very clear about who the security risks are. They're very clear about their support for organizations like NATO, and the Five Eye, for example, which is an intelligence sharing arrangement with our Anglo partners. And they're also clear that we need to do more in defense. I mean, this is some recent polling that I think Nanos has put out that's quite unambiguous. So that line, which continues to get pushed here domestically, that, oh well, it's a few lobby organizations that are interested in pushing defense. No, I think a lot of Canadians really understand the world not only has changed but is continually changing, and we need to step up to the plate. So I
And
think
I mean, there's a reason we call them political leaders, right? The role of the leadership is also to galvanize and direct and identify and lead. And I find it, to be honest, quite a weak excuse when political leaders, go ahead and say that, well, we will follow whatever the public says. We know from political science research, from public opinion research, etc., that the sweet spot is where the public recognizes the importance of a particular issue and broadly supportive of it, and the leaders identify a concrete plan to defend the interests, the security, and the prosperity of the public on that particular issue. And I think the Canadian public is increasingly recognizing the importance of we need to spend more and on capabilities, equip ourselves in a better way to protect our prosperity and security. And it's now incumbent on the leaders, policymakers, to put forward a plan that actually delivers on that particular desire that is clear, and understanding that is clear within the public. So I think hiding behind that is not particularly useful, because the public shows where they want to go. The leaders supposed to take that and shape it and lead.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I mean, I think this discussion on defense spending dovetails perfectly with with the challenge of Russia's war in Ukraine, and also the challenge that China poses. Because why are we talking about the need for more defense spending? I mean, primarily there's a range of different challenges in the world, but primarily it's great power competition, which in some senses never went away, but is coming back with a vengeance. And I think one thing that we haven't touched on so much, but the Institute has done a lot of work on, is the fact that it's not that we have Russia over here and China over here, but increasingly we're seeing that alignment and convergence. Just an example I'll give you, I think it was last week, we saw two Russian frigates in the Taiwan Strait. We see significant activity of the Russian Navy in the Pacific now, not as an existential threat to allies in the Indo-Pacific, but there as a spoiler, and there to to continue to work with the Chinese to find ways, vulnerabilities within those alliances to bleed resources, etc. So we're not just looking at disconnected threats. These theaters are increasingly interconnected,
And we are sitting in the middle of it. When you think about it, I mean, um, geographically, we're talking about an Atlantic where the eastern flank is actively at war. Our allies are basically, under imminent threat. Our partners, such as Ukraine, is is under occupation, invasion. A major war is going on in Europe on the eastern flank, on the Atlantic side. We are, whether we like it or not, or think about ourselves as such or not, we are also a Baltic nation, given our presence in Latvia, in the EFP, our commitments in the region. So it is a contested area. Arctic is becoming increasingly contested as climate change and other actors started to move in, such as China. European high north is particularly challenging, but our European Nordic partners are taking this much more seriously and upgrading their capabilities. And if they are upgrading there on the European high north, and we are not doing much over here on the Canadian Arctic, we do create a vulnerability, a weak spot that could be exploited. And in the Pacific, as you pointed out, it's a very contested area. So we are in the middle of three areas that are under contestation, that are be theaters of potential confrontation, and we just cannot really sort of close our eyes and not pay attention to this. I mean, uh, when people think about why, what's going on in Europe, in Ukraine matters to us, the stability of Euro-Atlantic area is a core national interest,
Mhm.
for Canada. The very fact that we benefited, our prosperity and security benefited significantly from a stable Euro-Atlantic area and has to remain as such is I think sometimes lost in translation. That's why we are there. That's why we need to support Ukraine. That's why it is not charity but enlightened self-interest. But we need to expand that to other regions, including the Indo-Pacific. We just cannot. And I know you have a lot more to say on this issue, but we cannot turn a blind eye or pretend that we don't hear when things go south in the Pacific, and I think that all requires a solid set of capabilities
Mm.
that will take time to develop. So if we don't want to do it today, we will eventually have to react, and but we that will cost a lot more for us, both in terms of blood and treasure, in the future. And that's why the attention, um, uh, and the resources should be developed today, not left until things really get out of hand.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess one of the things we've noted in one of our op-eds is, the best way to avoid crisis is to prepare. It doesn't mean that you can
Exactly.
completely avoid it, but as long as you can make some preparations, at least you can hope that you can deter or you can manage that crisis as best as possible. So, when we think about all of the oceans, I mean, I think you're right. We're in a different geography. Our interests set are different. And that's why I always push back when we hear Canadians talk about the fact that, well, what's happening in Asia is mainly the problem of the Americans or the Japanese or others. I often say, okay, you take a straight line from Vancouver to Tokyo, and you take a straight line from Sydney to Tokyo. It's closer from Vancouver to Tokyo. But look at the Australian relationship now with Japan, for example, as a quasi ally, a resident power. We have a massive Pacific coastline. In addition to our equities, obviously in the Arctic and in the transatlantic, it's not an either or, but all of the stability on all of those
Yes.
fronts is absolutely existential to us. It's not a luxury.
No.
Um, and the
And they're
second,
connected, as we keep sort of arguing. Those are not isolated, things that we can say, okay, we don't want to deal with this one, let the others deal with that one. No, especially for Canada, this is a very connected challenge. And not only, the nature of the challenge as such, but our adversaries
Mhm.
think in those terms as well, right? So they do that there's a reason why that alignment is increasingly closer between China and Russia. They do not necessarily see the challenging the West in the Arctic, in the Indo-Pacific, in Europe as separate things that they do. In other words, they do see that as a very connected system.
Yeah, and I think that's why, while the Chinese will rant and rave about NATO talking about the systemic challenge that China poses. I mean, China is clearly on their doorstep. I mean, with their Belt and Road projects, with other sorts of espionage and intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer. So it's not that NATO has taken this aggressive step or a European states have really moved quickly on this. They've moved very reluctantly, and some of them continue to move reluctantly when it comes to the challenge of China. But they've really been put in that position. The last point that I think is really important on this too is that, and I think this is really important as a Canadian for a Canadian audience, is that not only is our ocean geography important, but our continental geography informs so much as well. So I often say, and this would be true in the transatlantic sphere too. Our choices are different than others. Our choices are different than Australia's, as they're different from Germany's. It doesn't mean that they don't have difficult choices too, and they're not very committed to their relationship with the United States. But the United States is existential to us in trade terms and security terms. Is it possible in an alternative future for Australia not to be connected with the United States? It may be unthinkable and probably unlikely, but it is possible. It's feasible in the mindset. It's not possible in a Canadian context.
Not at
Uh,
all.
so that doesn't mean that we advocate that we do everything that the Americans do, but I think we have to keep that in mind in every element of foreign policy that we do, and have a realistic viewpoint on how we manage that, how we pursue our interests. Many of them are dovetailed with the Americans. Rather than just pretending that some third option is going to come along and will replace that.
And having that North American, I mean, that's, I think, sort of the key here, and which was sort of the basis of a lot of prosperity and security for Canada as well as the United States, is this Fortress North America, the continental security structure that is so integrated and so essential for projecting power across the oceans. That is what enabled that the projection of power, as well as the protection of interests and both economic and political interests outside. So maintaining that relationship is, as you pointed out, is existential, and that is the basis of the influence and power for Canada in the international system. Without having that safety and security and that well-integrated nature of the North American continental understanding, we will not be able to have the influence or benefit significantly from the influence we have and interest we pursued abroad. So I think that is sometimes, as you pointed out, is kind of taken it for granted and move on. But like every other relationship, it needs to be maintained, need to be cared for, and that requires a very good understanding of where Canadian interests are very closely aligned with the United States, and how we can actually protect and advance our interests together and in step with the Americans. And I think there is some sort of sense, as you pointed out, that that some people think that it might be some third option that's just not gonna fly in any shape or form. We're coming towards the end, so I want to sort of touch upon two things very quickly here. One on the China bit, and I want you to sort of expand a little bit more on why and how not only us, but also our European allies would need to recognize that they can't sit one out if there is a contingency in Indo-Pacific, and what that means for NATO. And the other one, and I'll perhaps start with that one, is our commitments to our European allies, particularly with regards to enhanced forward presence in Latvia. Germany recently announced, once the new bases are finished in Lithuania, they will be positioning 4,000 troops, bringing it up to a brigade level. A brigade is anything over 3,000 troops, so we're looking about 3,000 to 4,000 troops when we talk about a brigade level presence over there. Now, Canada does not, have the personnel, the troops by itself to bring it up to a brigade level, but we definitely need to ramp up our presence there. It is curious that, for example, our Danish allies announced that they are going to send 800 or so, perhaps a little bit more, troops to the enhanced foreign presence mission in Latvia, that Canada is a framework nation, before we sort of clarify what we will be doing. So I think that relationship is extremely important for Canada, and we need to, when we think about commitments, meeting our commitments to our NATO allies, we need to ensure that the EFB mission in Latvia is not left behind when our German allies in Lithuania, our British allies in Estonia, our American allies in Poland are stepping up and providing the necessary resources for the defense of the Baltics, while Canada is not stepping up. So I think that aspect, whether it comes up with the defense policy update, with real commitments, I think that's one thing we need to be looking for and arguing for, and having not making those investments, both in terms of recruitment, personnel, for instance, we start seeing the costs of that. Canada, as our senior fellow Rob Hubert recently wrote, for example, we were not part of the Air Defender 23, which is sort of the largest air defense exercise that NATO took place. and we did not take part in that. And the primary reason, if you read, either Rob or Richard Shmuka, you would see that there are issues with the personnel, there are issues with the availability of pilots, the planes, etc. So our underinvestment, both in personnel, in people, as well as in terms of equipment, started to show in in places where we are not taking part in the largest NATO air exercise, while Canada was one of the sort of fundamental contributors to the Air Force throughout the Cold War of NATO. So we are lagging behind, and we cannot let that happen, particularly when it comes to supporting our Latvian allies and our Baltic allies with our commitments. So we did make commitments. We need to keep them up, and we need to be able to step that up. So we can no longer push those things down the road. But on China, why and how our European allies need to come to terms that it is not someone else's problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, great points. First on the Baltics, let me just say a couple of lines, and then I can talk about China. I think you're right for a couple of reasons. Number one, I mean, in your discussion on the air defender exercises, highlighting as well your point that while some critics might say it's not about GDP percentages and raw money, but sometimes when you don't have enough pilots or capabilities, yes, it is about that. That's a factor. Yes, roles and responsibilities are important, but to a limit. Moving to the Baltics, I think our mission, I 100% violent agreement with you, for a number of reasons. Number one, it puts us in a leadership role. So it's important for us to be in a leadership role in the alliance. It's important for us not to be kicked into a secondary or tertiary role, but to step up, and not just to do that for 1 or 2 years, but to maintain that, to sustain that, to build on it, to enhance it. I think it's very important. And a third reason why I think our mission in Latvia is so important is because actually we're hearing from the Baltic countries who were right all along about some of the challenges of a revisionist Russia, and continue to be right on many of these issues. So rather than having a complacency, which you could have in Brussels, where you talk to the wide swath of NATO allies, and I'm not trying to throw them all under the bus, but they have different threat perceptions, different proximity, especially towards Russia. I think it's really important for us to be right there in the Baltics, and hear and understand from those that are right next to Russia and feeling this threat with the greatest proximity. So I think that's really important for Canada's future in NATO, to continue those conversations, and they're beyond just defense terms. I mean, we now have an active embassy in Latvia. We're opening 2 more embassies with accredited ambassadors in Estonia and Lithuania. So all of this is fantastic news for Canada, as you said, being more of a Baltic player, and seeing that as an important part of our interests in Europe.
And we should also, like as our German allies, for example, who announced a permanent presence in Lithuania when the bases are ready, we should, for example, move forward with a permanent stationing of Canadian troops rather than rotational troops. And we call that for in our op-ed on Ukraine, calling for the official termination of NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997 that would prevent a permanent stationing of NATO troops in the new member states for NATO. I think Canada should argue for the termination of that. And stationing of permanently, not sort of 6-month rotational bases, but a permanent stationing of Canadian troops in Latvia, ideally to the brigade level. And that's why, as you pointed out, I think our Baltic allies have been very much in the forefront of warning about a revanchist Russia. And that's why we, again, in that particular op-ed, argue that the line that our allies are taking, drop the membership action plan, fast track Ukrainian membership to NATO, engage in security commitments that will tie it up between now and the full membership to NATO, to ensure that the eastern flank is secure by supporting and equipping Ukraine with what they need to beat back Russian invasion. Those are all ideas that have been promoted and argued for years by our Latvian, Lithuanian, Estonian, Polish allies. So we have to be paying much more attention to that.
Yeah, I agree. And just to wrap things up quickly on China. So, I mean, a little context of the invasion, or the reinvasion in February 2022. and the decision process from some of the AP4 allies, which we talked before, all of them put sanctions on Russia. We don't have to get into the context of all of the relationships there, but they're complex, especially in Northeast Asia with Japan and South Korea. All of them have diplomatic reasons, energy security reasons to maintain some balance with Russia. And I think in particular for Japan, I think the primary factor for many years was actually to wedge in between Russia and China. This the dream, the hope that you could create a strategic wedge. All of these dreams were given up when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, and I don't think we should take that for granted. The reason that I reference the move by state, especially Japan and South Korea with their sanctions, Singapore surprisingly putting sanctions as well, which is not a state that puts sanctions on easily. The reason basically was this. Number one, of course, they felt horrible seeing the video screens, like all the rest of us did, of Ukrainian citizens being butchered by the Russians, and the egregious war crimes that continue to happen today. So that was first and foremost from a humanitarian scale. This was a conflict that we haven't seen the nature of, and basically in Europe since World War II. But there's a bigger thing at play, and I often call this a social contract right now between the Indo-Pacific states and the Europeans. And it's a rules-based order, a challenge, a flagrant challenge to the rules-based order and territorial integrity. And if you had countries like Japan and South Korea effectively saying, "Well, we're going to look the other way, and good luck, Europeans," could they reasonably expect to be knocking on European doors in the chance and the real potential that there could be a contingency in their part of the world? Taiwan obviously being the most likely scenario, but there's other potentials on the Korean Peninsula, South China Sea, etc. So I think this is the sort of the gauntlet being thrown down, I think, by both sides. There's a lot of friendliness on both sides, but there are expectations, implicit expectations that Europe will step up. How Europe steps up, I think, is a matter to be discussed. And I think a lot of Europeans will immediately say, "Well, we don't have the military capacity for that. We don't have the naval capacity." No one is really expecting, the German Navy to come and be a big player. But what we can accept, and I think what the Americans won't accept, is that Berlin and Paris, people are ducking under their chairs, saying, "Well, we're going to continue business as usual economically, and we'll say a couple meek things diplomatically." If there gets to be a conflict in Asia, and the United States is involved as the principal NATO ally, there's just no way our European member states can feel that they can disconnect themselves from this. So I think that's the sort of the framework here, is that why these things are interconnected is, fundamentally, again, it goes down to our common ally and security provider is the United States. It doesn't mean we do exactly what they do, but we can't benefit on one hand from their security provisions in Europe, and they're footing the bill to help the Ukrainians defend themselves, and then at the same point say, "Well, Americans, don't push us on China." So I think that's the framework that we need to be thinking about this on. And my last point on linking this back to Canada is, again, Canada, as you mentioned, Balkan, very eloquently. We're very much our geography. Just look at a map, and we are Indo-Pacific, we are transatlantic, we are Arctic, and we're continentally North American. We don't escape any of this, and it's in our interest to actually work with European friends to say, "Hey, we want to make sure the U.S. is fully engaged in Europe and helping Ukraine, but at the same point, we want to make sure you are engaged on the China file and in the Indo-Pacific." So I think Canada actually has a pretty unique role because of our geography and because of our placement next to the United States to actually take that advocacy role and go with it.
Yeah, to quote Benjamin Franklin, if we don't hang together, we will be hung separately. And these challenges requires North America and Europe to coordinate, to complement each other, and move as one. Because if we don't, as I said before, if we don't want to pay pennies today, we will pay hundreds of dollars in the future, and not only treasure, but we will pay the cost in terms of blood and treasure in the future. So I think on that cheerful note, we can end this particular episode of Inside Policy Talks. Once we're back from Vilnius, we might come back together again to discuss the outcomes of the summit and what that means for Canada and Canadians. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.